All right, so now it's time for the last of our special lectures. So we are going to hear from Dr. Freda Lewis-Hall. She's a former executive vice president, chief medical officer, and chief patient officer at Pfizer. And Freda has been a pioneer and leader in medicine for more than 40 years as a clinician, researcher, and leader in biopharmaceuticals and life science industries. She's a passionate advocate for health equity and improved outcomes for all patients. She's widely regarded for expanding outreach to patients, reshaping the focus on patient engagement and inclusion, improving health information and education, and amplifying the voice of the patient within company culture and decision-making. And here she will address the very important aspect of reducing disparities in clinical trials, particularly the need to increase racial diversity among those enrolled and ideas on how we can get there. So here is Freda Lewis-Hall.
Thank you, thank you. So the question is, diversity in clinical trials, are we there yet? The answer is a simple no. But my husband always says people don't change when they see the light, they change when they feel the heat. And COVID-19 gave us lots of light and plenty of heat that focused us as a healthcare community and as a public and media on diversities in health, in healthcare, and in healthcare research. And so I think that we're really in a moment in addressing diversity in clinical trials. First of all, this is not new. This is not new at all. If you look in the US alone, there are decades of reports that codify disparities in health outcomes, and in healthcare, and in healthcare research. And there have been many attempts over these decades to address the issues. Unfortunately, not all of them have had the desired outcomes. So we're still not there yet, but we're making progress. And hopefully some of our discussion today will help you become engaged in being a part of solving this longstanding and very important problem. So for starters, our health is affected by biology, our behavior, our environment, societal policies, lived experiences, and exposures. And these factors can be affected by a whole range of things: our age, our sex, our race and ethnicity, our socioeconomic status, our geography, our sexual orientation, and a whole host of other socio-demographic factors. So with all of this at the forefront, how do we think about diversity in clinical trials? Why is it important? What might we do about it? Now, I asked the question, are we there yet? And I answered very quickly, no. But there's a little bit of help in some data and statistics. The FDA started keeping track, if you would, about diversity, sex, age, sex, age, and other forms of diversity like racial and ethnic identification. So the 2020 snapshot, which was posted just recently, tells us that we're on the road, but we haven't quite arrived yet. If you look at the percentage of women in clinical trials, we're doing quite well. About 56% of participants in clinical trials for new molecular entities and therapeutic biologics in 2020, according to this FDA report, were women. The ethnic and racial makeup was about 75% white, and that's compared to census data of 2021 that says that the white population in the United States is around 59.3%. The percentage of Blacks who participated was 8%. That compares to about 12.6% in the US population. For Asians, 6%. They were close on point at 4.9%. And last but not least was the Hispanic population at 11% participation, representing about 18.9% in the US population in 2021. Age also has an opportunity and that is about 30% of people who participated in clinical trials were over 65. Now, this population that I just talked about was actually in the clinical trials, was actually a global population. The US represented about 54% of that total population. So if you did some correcting, if you would, for inclusion of sites that were outside of the US in this study, we still clearly have a ways to go. So what is it that we want to do to address diversity in clinical trials, and why is it important? So we know that as we develop and deploy clinical trials, we're attempting to evaluate the safety, the efficacy, and the effectiveness of a whole range of things: new diagnostics, new clinical treatments, procedures, and other like surgical interventions, as well as devices. So there's an entire range that we want to evaluate in the clinical trial process, a range of outcomes, as well as a range of things to be tested in this environment. And we must learn to account for this whole host of factors that I mentioned just a few of at the very beginning of my comments. Now, historically, clinical trials didn't usually look like the populations that the treatment might eventually be deployed to and could potentially help or affect. And it didn't necessarily represent populations that were affected by or even disproportionately affected by the diseases or conditions that were being studied. This shortcoming creates a gap in our understanding of the diseases and conditions, but as well, preventive factors and potential treatments. So many people talk about inclusion in clinical trials as a fairness issue. It's also an important issue around outcomes, clinical decision-making, and ultimately the science needs to help support fully understanding people who are affected by these diseases and conditions, and whether or not what we're studying could actually help, whether or not it could help equally or differentially, whether or not our treatments need to be modified in order to lead to the optimum outcomes for various patients who are different across these domains that we've just talked about. And ultimately, whether or not there may be a group for whom treatments that we have are not effective or as effective, and we need a whole new treatment. So there's a lot that we can think about and decide on as it relates to participation in clinical trials. But at the end of the day, if we ultimately want to fully serve all that we can serve, diversifying, making more inclusive our clinical trials should be at the top of our work plan. So what are the critical barriers and how might we address them? Let's do some of the barriers first. It's interesting, I try and think about this in a number of categories, and I'll just do two for purposes of this overview. The first is the work that needs to happen that would be conducted by or pursued by people who are shaping, deciding, and deploying clinical trials. So what does the group of members of the research environment or the healthcare environment that's being researched have to think about as we deploy? There are a lot of biases that currently exist in research after research into why we can't quite get clinical trials up and inclusive, demonstrates that the research ecosystem itself has some biases. That can be at the individual investigator level, it can be at the system decision-making level, it can be at the access level, but there are some things that we are doing as a research ecosystem that can be addressed and that represents barriers. And let me give you a couple of examples of that. Inclusion and exclusion criteria as we develop our protocols. Are we using inclusion or exclusion criteria that are exclusive of certain groups of people? It can either be just de facto, we're only accepting patients who are over 65 or who are under 65 or who are over 18 years of age. It could be that we're excluding patients because of an EGFR or a laboratory value, that we have a normative in, that we haven't included adjusted normatives. And I use EGFR as the example because there's actually an algorithm that adjusts an EGFR for African Americans. And if you don't include the normative value for African Americans and for others, then you may exclude a group of people. The same for FEV1. So thinking about your inclusion and exclusion criteria as it relates to laboratory values, imaging finding, and other things that may be different across age, sex, or racial and ethnic backgrounds. Formulations, if you're going to study in children, for example, do you want to do some adjustments in formulation early so that you can accommodate the inclusion of that particular population? Dosing is the same. Have you considered a group of people, Asians, for example, that may more likely have a CYP2C9 or V4C1 mutation that would lead to a need for adjustments in the dosing of the medications that you are testing? So these are all just a few of the examples of things that should be considered as you're developing your protocol. Even before that, thinking about what should be considered as the population to be studied. So do you know enough about the epidemiology of your disorder that you're studying or the condition that you're studying and the populations that it affects? Does it disproportionately affect someone, or does it differentially affect one community or group of people? And are you aware of that and give it consideration as you think about who you would want to recruit into your clinical trial? The other is the deployment of the clinical trials themselves by us as researchers. We are still quite reliant, even though that's changing, on sites. And many of the sites that are established and have expertise in this work are not established in areas that are accessible to a full range of the community. Rural communities often suffer. Urban communities that don't have access to the institutions or organizations that are actually conducting the clinical trials. So these are all things around the logistics of the trial that become important factors, just the mere sight of them. But the other thing is that the logistics that we design in. So how many imaging studies need to be done, and therefore a patient may have to travel great distances to get to those sites, or the number of lab draws that need to happen. And so dictating the number of days that a patient and their caregiver, for example, would have to travel to a site, whether or not a patient has access to some of the technology that would allow them to participate in a decentralized trial. So are we using remote monitoring and other things that would make this more accessible to patients who otherwise, for work reasons or childcare reasons or ambulation issues or a whole host of things, couldn't actually make it to our sites? Those are just a few examples of things that we as the research community have as barriers. The second group, I guess, of barriers are those barriers that affect the community and the people who would volunteer to participate in clinical trials. The first I'll say is the lack of awareness. Most people don't know about clinical trials except what they've heard through the grapevine. And so there are not a lot of ways that patients, members of the community who might be willing to volunteer for a clinical trial would even know what they are, how they are conducted. They may have misconceptions about them that are driven by just a flat out lack of awareness. Or the awareness of a specific trial. So, how do you find one of these things, even if you want to participate? So, awareness is a very significant issue. We also have an opportunity to help patients understand because they're concerned about prior challenges for certain communities in the conduct of clinical trials. There have been atrocities that have become a part of the community's awareness of what a clinical trial is. So how do you address those things? By talking about the provisions to protect patients in a clinical trial setting that have been put in place. How do you get patients to understand and know what the safety provisions are now so that how their physical and personal safety is protected in a clinical trial, as well as their rights are protected in a clinical trial? And then how do you engage a community? Much feedback from the community about why there's a lack of participation for certain communities is, it's not just not something that they're aware of, but also that they don't necessarily trust because we as clinical researchers are not engaged in their communities on a day-to-day basis. We even hear things from the community like, you only come when you need me, when you want me to do something you need, like participate in a clinical trial. But where were you last week when my cousin was diagnosed with MS and we couldn't find help anywhere? Or where were you when I needed education and information about my health in general, and you were nowhere to be found? So finding a way to engage more fully in communities is a part of the potential opportunity to address barriers in the conduct and the inclusion of clinical trials in communities that are historically underserved or disadvantaged in some way as they relate to health and clinical trials. So those are some of the barriers. What are some of the solutions? And I'll do them in the two categories still. So we as a healthcare, as a healthcare and as a healthcare research community have an opportunity to address some of the things that we just talked about in the conduct of our own business. So ensuring that we have the epidemiology straight as we begin to think about and articulate the studies that need to be done, that we, if we don't have the data available, that we work in collaboration to try and build systems so that we can truly understand what is needed in communities for the treatment of clinical trials. So how do we address those barriers from a data access, data collection, and data analytic perspective? And then how do we make a more widely available through the healthcare ecosystem what that data is so that we know what communities need to be engaged in how in order to ensure that we're meeting both prevention and treatment needs and understanding disease processes across the diversity of our communities. The second is including that data. I mentioned all of the challenges of understanding and applying that data to the development of a protocol so that it's patient friendly and that we're able to both collect the data that we need to answer some of the key questions that need to be answered, but we've also made it a participatable trial. And so that becomes especially important. And then how do we address some of the logistics that really create barriers to patients? Logistics to awareness, logistics to awareness of clinical trial process in general. How do we also address the logistics of and the awareness of participation in a clinical trial? So how do we ask a patient, if you would, or make them aware of a trial that's going on? And what mechanisms do we use to do that by empowering the community to want to know and then to be able to know about a clinical trial that might be right for them or one of their other community members? How do we engage with trusted intermediaries in the community? So how do we engage with the non-clinical trial site community-based health systems so that people know that we're there, that we're engaged, that we're a part of the overall system that's meant to help them get the health and the health care that they need? And last but not least, how do we address some of the mistrust in the system? We can do that in two ways. The first is inclusion. Patients, again, have told us, don't just drop in here when you need us to participate in a clinical trial. Come and help us understand health issues for our community, how to address them outside of the clinical trial setting, and then how to participate more fully in the clinical trial system. Do we want members of the community on advisory boards, for example? We want to tell them about IRBs, but is there a space for a trusted member of their community to be a part of an IRB or an oversight committee that's working in the community or in the healthcare system that they participate in that conducts the clinical trials? So there's a whole host of work that can be done that really makes us partners with the community. So the healthcare research system and the community partner then to do work that becomes important to all communities. So that is a lot. I asked the question at the very beginning, whether or not we were there yet. No, we're not. But I think that there's a pathway, a road, and partially paved. We need the help from each and every one of you to finish that pavement out and to make it a high-speed highway, if you would, for the partnership, the collaboration, and the full-on work together to ensure inclusion for all communities in the work that is so important to us, in the research that will deliver health and better health outcomes to everyone. Thank you.